This is a bonus video I'm putting up on the Batgap channel for a couple of friends, Jerry Freeman and Ishtar Howell, both of whom have been Batgap guests. I've never put anything on the Batgap channel that I hadn't created myself, but I'm making an exception here because these guys are good friends and the content of the video is relevant to Batgap. You'll see as you watch the video, or you can look in the show notes below for more details, but it's a discussion of research that Jerry Freeman has been doing on the history of effortless forms of transcending meditation that stem primarily from the legacy of Swami Brahmananda Sarasvati, who was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's guru and Shankaracharya of Jyotirmath in the mid 20th century. So go ahead and enjoy the video. And I probably won't be doing this kind of thing very often, but I'm making an exception in this case.
Mapping a way forward, transcending and other meditative practices throughout the stages of awakening. Ishtar is my dear friend of about 7 years' time, and I'm just really delighted that he's here. He's been teaching since 2002, I believe, in the tradition of Ashaya Ascension meditation, which is in the lineage of Maharishi and Gurudev. It was developed by a TM teacher who created a movement. That person passed away in 1997. And since then, there's been interesting history that's illustrative, that reflects some of the same history that we're living through now after the passing of Maharshi, who founded the TM organization, the TM movement that we spent so many years in. Ishtar is, I would have to say, a gifted meditation teacher. He's very deep and broad, spanning multiple cultures and traditions and faith backgrounds in a way that I think could be helpful to us as we look at all of the different possibilities for transcending meditation and try to address the really urgent need for transcendence in every culture, in every tradition, for people with all backgrounds and inclinations. So I look forward to our conversation with Ishtar. I have some background material that I'd like to describe before we get into that discussion. But Ishtar, if you would care to say hello to us, we would be honored.
Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And how could I turn down your invitation, Jerry? So, yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So to get started, clearly there's far more material than we can possibly even touch on in a single meeting like this. So I think this is likely to become an ongoing process and a conversation, hopefully, that will bring in more and more people. And I would hope we would find a way out of our little TM silo and begin cross-pollinating and interconnecting with wise and experienced meditation teachers from various backgrounds who may be able to inform us of ways that our knowledge can be deepened, and we may be able to offer them insights from our experience to advance the project for all of humanity. So I've made some notes here, so excuse me if I'm a little awkward with my notes, but I don't want to get carried away here. The first thing I would say is after doing the research that I've been for the past couple of years on the present state of transcending meditation in the world, my outlook is much more optimistic than it had been. we've been thinking, the world needs transcending. This is the urgent need. Humanity needs to rise to more universal consciousness. And we're the only ones who can do it. That's what Maharishi taught us, that we have exclusive knowledge that's the highest knowledge, and it's up to us. But I started to wonder how many organizations and how many teachers actually are teaching effortless transcending meditation now. And I was amazed to discover there are many, and some of them are huge organizations reaching millions and millions of people. And at this point, let me see if I can share my screen. Scroll this down. Transmission of effortless transcending mantra meditation in the lineage of Shankara. And it begins with the now famous quotation from our dear friend Dana Sawyer, emeritus professor of religious studies and world religions, who said, "I can say that every Dandi Swami that I've met, which is nearly half of all of them, meditate exactly in the TM way with no concentration. They too favor the mantra easily. Furthermore, they all claim this is the traditional method." And then you can see the lineage, which starts with Shankara, and then we skip several hundred years and we go to Gurudev. And the interesting thing here is this entry, which is Swami Satyananda. And he literally opened a meditation center in 1949. He also opened an orphanage in Malaya, which is now called Malaysia. This is outside of Maharshi's, zero connection with Maharshi, zero connection with the TM organization. From him, a Benedictine monk, he was not a monk when he met Swami Satyananda, named Father John Main, was initiated in 1955 and introduced traditional Shankara mantra japa meditation, calling it Christian meditation, because Swami Satyananda told him to meditate correctly, you as a Christian must have a Christian mantra. And that's something that Maharshi never did. Gurudev always taught meditation according to Ishta Devata. What is your connection with divinity? But Maharshi didn't do that. He assigned the mantras quite arbitrarily with an algorithm that most of us are familiar with, that has actually caused a lot of difficulty, because people in other faith traditions are quite put off by that, because those to them are Hindu deity mantras. So the significance there, Father John Main's Christian meditation is a huge movement in the world right now, to this day. It has been over a period of decades. There are over 3,000 groups in over 120 countries, and they have taught literally millions of people. For example, in the last few years, all of the primary school students in Trinidad and Tobago have been initiated into Shankara mantra japa meditation under the name Christian meditation, using a Christian mantra. A couple of quotes. One principal noted that the noise level dropped so much, the people in the surrounding buildings called to school to ask if there was anything wrong. And quote, when I asked the children how meditation makes you feel, they said things like when my grandma hugs me, like when I see a beautiful sunset, like when I see a Christmas tree with all the lights on, like when I see a big full moon. So there are numerous other variations of effortless transcending meditation that are on the in the document, but I will draw attention only to two others, actually three, one of which I already have. Under Maharshi's lineage, which Christian meditation is not, There are two. There's Pandit Ravi Shankar's Art of Living, which teaches effortless transcending meditation by the name Sahaja Samadhi meditation. Well, Sahaja Samadhi is Sanskrit for effortless transcending. And that is hugely popular, hugely successful. It's a massive worldwide organization. They're teaching millions and millions of people to transcend. And then the other one is Christian centering prayer, which was developed by Abbot Thomas Keating, Father Basil Pennington, and Father William Menninger, who worked for years in a monastery with Trappist monks, practicing Shankara mantra japa meditation from Maharshi, Zen from the Japanese Roshi Joshu Sasaki, and teachings from the Christian mystical tradition. And many millions of people practice Christian centering prayer. The organization, by the way, for Christian meditation, which was founded by John Main, is the World Community for Christian Meditation. And the organization Father Keating, Abbot Keating founded, is called Contemplative Outreach. And they have websites, and you can see they're very, very active globally. There's a lot going on. A student of Dana Sawyer published his doctoral thesis. He was not doing his doctorate under Dana. He was doing it at another university, but he did happen to be Dana's student, named J. Gill Lee, who is himself a Methodist minister. He published essentially a book called Sources and Issues in Contemplative Christian and Contemporary Christian Contemplative Prayer, Thomas Keating's Centering Prayer, and John Main's Christian Meditation. And he described Christian centering prayer and Christian meditation in terms of, quote, overall attitude of gentleness and effortlessness, the acceptance of invasive thoughts as necessary elements, the downplaying of affection and emotion, the importance of sound and rhythm, and the insignificance of the meaning of a prayer word or mantra, and the notion of consciousness. So they're really describing what we understand as effortless transcending meditation, even if it's packaged a little bit differently and the instructions are not strictly identical to what we learned with our meditation. So generally speaking, I do not feel that Maharshi's body of teaching is a finished work. I think it's a starting point. I think there are strengths and shortcomings. There are certainly many things that are missing. And I think it's up to us to develop the next generation of teachings. And the parameters for how to do that, we can talk about as we get into this discussion. But, and I have some thoughts about that from my research that may provide some guidance as to how we might go about doing it. So you see here Ascension meditation, or the Ashaya's meditation, the Ashaya's Ascension, developed around 1990 by a former TM teacher named Von Abrams, who later took the name Maharishi Sadashiva Isham, or MSI. It was originally organized under the Society for Ascension, and the practice experienced a wave of popularity in the 1990s, opened a campus in Waynesville, North Carolina that could house a couple hundred Ascension teachers and trainees at a time. After Abrams' death in 1997, Ashaya's Ascension divided into a series of successor organizations reflecting varying approaches to doctrine and culture, typical of such groups after the founder's passing. And then I go on to name some of the organizations and websites that are involved with Ashaya Ascension meditation. But we have one of the world leaders of this meditation movement with us today, and that's, again, my dear friend Ishtar Howell. I wonder if you'd be willing to talk to us a little bit. Ishtar, you have the
Yes.
floor.
How long and which part, Jerry? Maybe you can steer me into what's germane.
Well, I can think of two areas that we might discuss, and we have lots of
Mm,
time. The two areas are um, gaining some more sense of the patterns that organizations go through, because the TM organization, this little genealogy is a clear depiction of how splintered they
mm,
typically become, and a similar thing has happened with Ashaya's Ascension.
yes.
And also, I would love to get into the nitty-gritty of mantra selection, um, the involvement of the heart
Mm,
in practice of meditation, and how that facilitates um, ripening and deepening of experience. Um, we've had discussions privately about the system that you use, the various, I don't know exactly what all
no.
forms of meditation you teach. I know you teach Ashaya's Ascension meditation, but I think you teach a
Yeah.
few other. I think you have quite a little toolkit of practices that you have to offer. So why don't you
Yes.
tell us a little bit about those?
Well, I could start with the Ashaya's Ascension too, and share the first technique as well. Because it's quite different than it's not using Sanskrit primarily, although that does get into the mix at some point. It's which when I first learned, I was just coming off of reading. I was 18 for I would say I was just coming off of reading Yogananda's autobiography, and I think I was temporarily sort of a Sanskrit chauvinist in a way, because he's got these wonderful things about, Sanskrit is the greatest, most scientifically created language. I thought that's the language of spirituality, for that period. But th this is almost, I've always felt doing this practice like I'm some kind of mix between a Christian monk and a Hindu monk. In a sense, this Ashaya's Ascension practice is like a prayer mantra that's primarily in the first language of the practitioner, which with English, of course, I thought what a mongrelized language English is. What a mix. How could anything spiritual come of that? And the first technique of that practice is this. It's part of it is the word praise, simply the word praise. The second part is of a word that the individual practitioner has, that basically their word for the divine, or their word for the greatest quality for good if they're agnostic or atheist. And I didn't think such a phrase when I first saw the teachers write it on the board would have any effect whatsoever. And take me to the states that I had been experiencing previously with other meditation practices. And yet in about 30 seconds, I was in a deeper samadhi than what I was in when I had previously had a near-death experience as a 13-year-old. And so I was quite blown away with the poetry of it. And soon out at the end of the weekend, after learning a few other phrases with it, I was experiencing myself in everything and everywhere, seemingly at all times, et cetera, these sorts of things. And uh, so that was that. I was very surprised that it came from a TM teacher, because I had a little bit of knowledge of, I hadn't learned TM at that point. I'd actually turned it down at 14. I could have learned TM and raked a teacher's leaves for 3 months, which for me was a recreational activity. So that was a pretty good, would have been a good deal for me. But something in me had decided it wasn't quite the right fit. So that was what I've been mostly doing for a few years. Then at some point, I figured out that TM was the effortless practice of bija mantras, and the way that we do the ascension practice is, and because it comes from Vaughn Abrams, it's in the exact same effortless way. In fact, I think some of the steps of instruction, the languaging is quite similar. I'm not sure on that, but I've just from the people I've talked to, and so same method. So I just at one point decided I'll slot in some bija mantras and use this method. And of course, it was also delightful to do that. So yes, I've experienced transcendence in a 100 different ways with techniques or non-techniques. I have to say that my little Ascension world, develops similar, what I think of as myopic tribal attitudes that spiritual groups get when they think like, this is surely the place where God is. Most, most collective, we have a mission, and I thought I didn't really buy into that so hard because I'd seen The Life of Brian before. And I think that film and others like it immunized me a little bit. I mean, it's very heady, of course, the sense that you're in this, like, you're at the leading edge of where destiny is trying to unfold and the evolution of a species. It can get very, much like that. But I always was much more ecumenical in all ways. Had the bent, and I didn't like people sort of. I didn't trust people sort of separating into little eddies and talking shit about each other. When people were basically touching the same transcendent space, and so it seemed a little bit funny in that way. So yeah, I did this, had a very good effect immediately with the practice, and then I thought, well, of course, this might be some kind of workshop high, even though I don't think I'd ever experienced one of those before. I was cautious, and within 2 weeks, I realized it wasn't a high, and that I'd sort of found the music that I'd been searching for, which I think I did. It was strange that I turned down TM as a practice. I had to put it together later. Funnily, the first time that I listened to the Beatles' White Album, I'm alone in my own room in this little CD player. I had a strange vision of a short Indian man sitting on my bed. It's like, full disclosure, people don't know me. There's lots of this kind of woo-woo stuff happened in my life. I kind of kept my feet on the ground with it, but I didn't push it away to have it stop happening. So I saw an Indian man smiling at me on the bed, and for about 3 seconds, and then he disappeared. And then I was watching like a 60 Minutes thing, with my dad, and I saw the guy, and it was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who I was not yet familiar with at that time. So I've always often wondered how I didn't get sort of pulled into the what I was calling the TM universe. But there was just something in me that something in my heart that said, no, let's not go to Fairfield. It's probably a lovely place, but I think we're a little bit too wild. That was what the 14-year-old heart was saying at the time. So yeah, I had weird transcendence with a lot of things, which also made me open. I mean, one time I was just walking around my house, and a voice from inside my heart said, "If you watch the film Hudson Hawk right now, you will be thrown into a transcendent state." And that shit makes no sense, but I was just rolling with it. So I put the damn VHS in, pressed play, and within 5 minutes of watching, this really wonderfully underrated film with Bruce Willis and Danny Aiello singing cat burglars. I mean, that's a wonderful concept. There I was back in NDE territory again, which there's lots of different sort of near-death experiences, but I think the most important part of mine was being put into a completely silent place, which was, samadhi. Ultimately, I didn't know that word at the time as a kid, having such a thing. But so lots of, I kind of came to the early opinion that techniques and practices had certainly had an objective value, but on another hand, I had this very early sense that teachers, practices, and things also in a way are kind of like permission slips we give ourselves. So I had a sense that, falling into samadhi was kind of like slipping on a divine banana peel. And so if we were sufficiently open, could happen at any time, but that's simply that most of us, myself included, required something that was structured in a certain way that would function in some ways as a permission slip. And some permission slips are more universally effective than others. And that was, more or less the conclusion I came to from such strange ways of entering, into that one field.
Let me ask you a question. A year or so ago, you conducted and completed a teacher training course.
Yeah.
Ascension meditation. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's structured and that was about how that went?
Yeah, it was very similar to the one that I went through, and I've come to learn that actually that was one of the places that Vaughn/MSI kind of tweaked or differed from I think how TM teacher trainings were being carried out in the 70s and 80s and maybe even 90s and aughts. Mine was a little bit longer, but my teacher training that I went through was 6 months, 5 months of it. We're basically 10 to 16 hours every day, closed-eyed meditation, and we're not breaking it up with asanas all the time and learning how to teach in the middle. It was just sort of straight, yoga twice a day, but kind of bookending the meditation period and there's freedom of movement. Obviously, go get some fruit or something like that. But me and people of a certain disposition, I would go down as a student at 9 a.m. after I finished my asanas and my sun salutations, and I would 8 hours would just cruise on by until the 5 p.m. dinner bell. Kind of like that, and that was just every day for months. And I did the training in India in a very similar way. Taught people sun salutations if they weren't very familiar with them, got them into asanas. But they're doing volume closed-eyed meditation, and then the last month of the training, 2 weeks to a month of the training, was basically teaching people how to teach a class effectively, sort of best practices, how to guide people into meditation and do that. And of course, in the middle, we would have evening meetings. The ones in my training that I was running, I kept shorter than the ones I so-called grew up with. I'd like to send people to bed at a decent time. So I'm getting into the minutiae here, but that's basically what would happen. And then very quickly with people in this, there'll be a period in which the tensions start to come off. And then there'll be a period when people start to have, maybe deeper experience of samadhi and of course every student was different in where they were coming in and what was going on. So I liked having a small class where I could give as much individual tailored attention to each participant as possible and not sort of paint everybody with a broad brush. So yeah, it was just a cozy little house of meditators in Tiruvannamalai, about a kilometer from the Ramana ashram, and love yoga on the rooftop. Just a joy to see people very quickly experiencing genuine witnessing consciousness, for instance, and then seeing people start to have spontaneous experience of samyama. And spontaneous. Some of them would, I was dealing with 30-year-olds right now, and I found that sometimes these 30-year-olds of these days can, go pretty quick with certain things, certain openings, and so some of them were opening into profound unitive experiences, just openings.
And about how long do you suggest that people do this?
Oh, that's a place where I don't know if TM has changed. That's a place we differed because this Vaughn/MSI, like a good Aries after my own heart. Well, he was quite a wonderful extremist, which I love, zealous people. So, ain't no like capping things at 20 minutes. It was like, that's your minimum, but please do go to town with longer sessions. So I was, at the time of learning, I was sort of a stay-at-home teenage monk doing 6 hours of meditation a day. And so thankfully my teachers weren't stopping me from that. They tried to a little bit because they're afraid, the de-stressing might be too intense. I was like, screw that, give me that intensity. But so yeah, we would, in the same way, we'd kind of say like, do 20 minutes 2 or 3 times a day, and also do it while falling asleep. And we can also do it with the eyes open as an ancillary practice. And that whole I'll speak on bija mantras too. That whole it divides the mind from itself stuff, I think, is bunk, straight up. because
which divides the mind?
The whole "don't do your mantras with the eyes open because it divides the mind from itself." That whole line. Oh no, no. I found that I was more present. Did a lot of my sadhana working in our we owned a restaurant, and I started as the the 18-year-old dishwasher, but eventually I got to be trained by a cordon bleu trained chef who was in our collective. So I was 20 and I was running a restaurant after he left and sort of took over. And I was working 16-hour days at that time. I would open up at 6 a.m. and I would be washing the mats at 10 p.m. So I didn't have my usual time for closed-eyed that I was used to, but I was just doing it open-eyed. And I have to say the witnessing and the samadhi and the unitive experiences were just on fire in that period. And I thought doing mantras when I was in conversation with people would actually be stilted. So I did think like, oh, I don't want to do that. That was going to make me a poor listener. And then I found it was strangely quite the opposite. I thought of myself already as a fairly perceptive, good listener and good at picking up on cues, but that just injected steroids into that capacity. When I would at least do these ascension mantras, to be honest, I can't speak for Shreem or, Kaleem, but at this point, I don't think they would, bija mantras would, gum up the works and somehow make me less effective at whatever the hell I was doing. They always made me more effective at what I was doing. Yeah.
And why do you call it ascension meditation?
Well,
particularly,
I didn't pick the name, but in fact, if I got to choose the name to match more of my experience, I would say rather out of body for my early life when I learned. So for me, a more apt name would have been descension, because I felt a complete sense of, whoa, is this what they mean by, being in one's body? I thought I was here because I could play basketball and stuff like that, but wow. But he's basically, I think Vaughn was more or less trying to say transcending without saying it, maybe so he didn't get his ass sued or something like that. That's my pet theory. So ascension in this case doesn't mean to like leave one's body. It rather means the same idea as transcending in the way that it's, I think, used in TM, which is mean to touch the transcendent, which he called the ascendant. To me, that's always a very stilted name. He could have done better with that, but that's hence the name. So same idea, an easy method of going into samadhi and having the samadhi spread out through more and more of one's lived experience.
This is a great discussion, and I really appreciate this, Ishtar, particularly you and Jerry, for your preparation. I want to just add, what we're talking about mainly here is mantra or japa meditations from the chart, Jerry, you presented, which is great. And what I understand with that is it occupies the mind a little bit so that the transcending can happen. We get pulled into that place. I'm involved with meditations that don't use japa or mantra. I'm involved with meditations that are just falling back on awareness. And it's just a process of continually letting go into awareness itself. And the particular teachers I'm following with that are Ajay Shanti and Muji in particular. And I think that for someone starting off, it would probably be a very difficult meditation to do because our minds are so busy. But after so many years of meditation, it's just so easy to turn back on awareness and fall into it and let go more and more. So I just want to add that as another, at least a method of transcending that I've found that's very easy, very effortless. It's basically don't do anything and just what's left. Let go of everything, don't do anything, and what's left. And what's left is that pure awareness. So I just wanted to add that into the mix here today, since we're looking at myth as a transcending.
This opens a whole territory of discussion, which I had hoped we would be able to get into. There are whole large categories of meditation other than mantra japa meditation. There are various kinds of mindfulness meditation. There are what's called mind wandering meditations. And one of this, what Scott has described sounds like it may be an example. Keikuni Minton is a former TM teacher that I was on Purusha with for a number of years. When he left the TM group, he went on to get his PhD in clinical psychology, and he's a major founder of a whole system that's used in clinical psychology that includes mindfulness practice. And I've looked at some of his guided mindfulness meditations online, and they're just beautiful. They're really what I've observed is, in looking at some of the just starting to look at some of the leading teachers. Another example would be Jack Kornfield, who's another very well respected PhD clinician and longtime Buddhist monk and practitioner. His mindfulness practice has a beautiful, expansive quality about it. And so there are these variations in the way practices are done that I think are important in finding the meditation or finding the practice that's as closely as possible suitable to the moment in that person's expanding experience. One thing that happens, for example, with TM is if a long-term TM meditator begins a new practice, oftentimes there's a breakthrough. And I think that's because TM opens certain areas, but there's some areas that it doesn't. And it facilitates the ability to open. And so when you introduce a new practice that has a somewhat different dimension to it, and someone who's been meditating 20, 30, 40 years with TM learns that new practice, sometimes there's just a spectacular, oh my gosh, this new practice is the be all and end all. My God, my universe just completely opened up. Well, we have to be careful not to assume that whichever new practice we're taking on somehow or other is the universal answer to all practices, but that it hit the nail on the head for that particular moment to open up that new dimension. And Adyashanti in particular could report that over the years, over his decades of teaching, this has happened thousands of times with long-term TM meditators who have come to his teachings, probably among others, and learned some of the practices that he was suggesting.
I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about how how human beings uplifting their attention from complaining to praise and gratitude is essential for ascension, and why exactly Von Abrams made that the core of his first 4 practices.
Sure. So one thing which I think was very good about that practice or the ascension practice is that I didn't have to be actively feeling anything. It didn't have to make a mood happen or anything like that. I didn't have to feel active appreciation, gratitude, or love. There was some strange automatic, sort of thinking it mechanically. You could say that worked. And I'll share a fun experience from that. I was once working a busy Sunday in the restaurant, and I had heard that a food critic from the Oregonian newspaper, it's a big Oregon paper, was out in the dining area, and my convection oven decided to die. And that I really needed that to cook the potatoes swiftly enough. Anyways, so I was in quite a mood on the surface, and I was swearing up a storm at the thing, and then one of my colleagues came over and said, "Hey, Ishtar, don't put that bad energy. You could make somebody sick." And I said, "Hey, check yourself. You're projecting on me. You got to look deeper. I'm actually doing my techniques right now, even though I'm saying convention oven and stuff like that. And so she said, okay, we'll see about that. And you know, monks are terrible to each other. My God. Anyhow, somebody was approaching the ticket window, you know, and I was like, oh God, maybe she was right. I hope I didn't make a bad batch of potatoes. And they started saying like, you know, I'm an energy worker and I'm very sensitive to the energies in my food. I'm going like, okay, moment of truth, you know. And then he said, what did you do to these potatoes? These are the greatest potatoes I've ever tasted in my life. What were you saying to them? And then I had a bit of a laugh at that. And I actually had two others come and make a comment, and I'd never had anybody praise the potatoes before or after that, which told me something, that even though I wasn't on the surface feeling much appreciation, because actually the second person who came said, I felt so much gratitude and love in my dish. I have to tell you that. I want to tell you. Even though I wasn't feeling that on the surface, whatever the hell was going on in the subtler levels with those strange little phrases was doing something. So on that level, I think it's terribly important. And I have taught quite a number of sort of old transcendental meditators. People have been doing it for 30 years or so over the time. And the most common thing that they would tell me as far as a difference in their experience, of course, we can't really, just from that, as Jerry was pointing out, you can't really tell the objective dynamics of things. There's too many variables. But one thing they would tell me is that doing this praise, gratitude, love-based practice feels like full body TM. That's a word that people would use often. They would say, this feels like TM, except the heart and the body have a much easier time of being involved in the process. Or they would say, there's more, the Shakti is easier to have developed in this. That's another way people would phrase things. And I would have to agree, because in my time, at least subjectively, of course, it's an anecdote. And my experience is that I would have this kind of every step into the silent space was very quickly attended to with this sense of Shakti moving in praise, waves of appreciation, gratitude, and love, and that the two would have a wonderful virtuous circle as far as the one developing and leading into the other. And of course, without the practice, I can't count the times that I was a depressed teenager and missing one's dead mother, and sort of having a very sort of limited view of one's personal dilemmas. And I would look at a cherry blossom, and just my appreciation of the beauty of the cherry blossom would have this kind of wrenching open effect. And if I had a few trees in a row, I would soon find myself in what genuine transcendent states where I and the tree would merge into one thing.
There is a ladder of techniques, right? A series of techniques, maybe 30 techniques.
God, no, way more than that. There's a bunch and there's little subparts, but to the credit of the Ascension teachers and even Vaughn/MSI, there really isn't much of an upselling culture. So actually, it's like a lot of people I know, they'll learn the first 4 techniques and they'll cruise with that, and that's more than enough, and nobody ever pushes them to get into the back catalog. But of course, as a curious fellow, I did, and learned them all. And going to teacher training courses, one learns them all as well.
This will provide a little bit of a template that may help make this exact discussion that we're having a little more concrete. So let me share the screen here. From the Tantra Loka of Abhavinagupta, which is one of the major texts of Kashmir Shaivism, there's the principle of upayas, and lots written, volumes and volumes and volumes about upayas. Now, according to Swami Lakshman Ju, who is a very close friend and collaborator with Maharshi, an upaya is simultaneously a state of consciousness and the practices that go with that state of consciousness. And from the Tantra Loka, It describes, this is chapter 1, verse 229, 3 upayas. Anuvapaya, which is the means or practices that are based on dualism. Shaktopaya, which are the means or practices that are partly dualistic and partly non-dualistic. And Shambhavopaya, which is the means and practices that are based on non-dualism. And then here we can correlate those with the major states of consciousness. I've left off deep sleep and dreaming just to make things fit. But of the 7 major states of consciousness, as Maharishi defined them, the third state, waking consciousness, is associated with Anuvapaya, which is dualism. Waking consciousness is a dual experience, as is the fourth state, transcendental consciousness, which is Anuvapaya, which is dualism. In this case, the dualism is not simultaneous. Well, it's true in waking consciousness also. In waking consciousness, the one side of the duality that you're able to experience is the relative. And in transcendental consciousness, the one side of the duality that you're able to experience is the transcendent. And then you have what Maharishi called cosmic consciousness, or what more generically can be called witness consciousness. And early cosmic consciousness, again, is Anuvapaya, because you have the absolute experienced inwardly and the relative experienced outwardly, and they do not intermix. But then what Maharishi called the 6th major state of consciousness, or God consciousness, and I'm going to say that's not really a distinct major state of consciousness. There's not an awakening start of it, and then an awakening beyond it that gets you into another state. It's a continuum. It's a sliding sort of a thing. As Lakshmanju described it, the rising of witness consciousness toward unity/Brahman consciousness. That is Shaktopaya, mixed dualism and non-dualism. As dualism develops and evolves toward non-dualism. And then the 7th major state of consciousness, unity/Brahman consciousness, which is Shambhavopaya, which is pure non-dualism. Unity, oneness. Now, practices can be sorted according to this matrix. So, for example, transcendental meditation, as we learned it, is an Anuvapaya practice. You transcend or not. You go beyond the mind or not. And then gradually, the transcendence starts to coexist, first at very quiet levels, and then more and more, along with more dynamic levels, until it starts to persist. But there isn't anything in the TM technique that addresses mixed dualism and non-dualism, or pure non-dualism, because all you do is transcend and come out, transcend and come out. Dye the cloth, fade the cloth, dye the cloth, fade the cloth. Now, when you start involving the emotions in the transcending, then you start to have a connection, a deeper connection between the absolute, the transcendent, and the relative, the feelings, the subtle thoughts, the senses, and that can extend out into the environment. Now, to give you a sense, this line of inquiry began in the early mid-1970s, maybe 1976, 1977 for me. My early experience with TM was very profound. Lots of awakening of the same sort that Ishtar is talking about. Not quite as woo-woo as he describes, but lots of witnessing and stabilizing that. And then at one point when witnessing had stabilized, and that was in the middle 1970s, I went to a long meditation course for TM teachers. They called them ATR courses. And I got what Maharishi labeled an Age of Enlightenment technique. That technique involved starting with very localized parts of the body, extending your awareness out geographically, extending your awareness further and further out into the cosmos and beyond into the highest heaven, and then bringing the awareness back to the body. Within 6 months, maybe 10 months of receiving that technique, I was in unity consciousness. And I thought, now, wait a minute. This technique has complemented my, dye the cloth, fade the cloth, dye the cloth, fade the cloth, dip into the transcendent, do dynamic activity. And there's something going on here. And at the time, Maharishi stopped teaching the Age of Enlightenment technique. Later, I think it came out as an advanced technique. But I thought, there's more to practices than just dye the cloth, fade the cloth. And we need to know, how do all of these different possibilities of practice fit together? In Buddhism, there are metta practices where you extend your awareness out, starting with yourself. May I be safe and happy and free. May the person closest to me be safe and happy and free. And you extend and extend and extend until you get to, may all beings be safe and happy and free. Well, that, to my mind, is a Shaktopaya or a Shambhavopaya practice. And why can't we put that kind of practice together with simple transcending practices and let them complement each other? And let's develop these higher states of consciousness. I think that's a lot of the reason that long-term TM meditators have breakthroughs when they start some other kind of practice. Now, that's my little speech on that. And let me close the, stop the screen share. And as you were, go back to your discussion.
No, Jerry, I just want to thank you, because I didn't know this, but there were certainly marked elements of that Age of Enlightenment technique that you describe in the corpus of the Ashaya's Ascension. So I didn't know that connection. So thank you for mentioning that. And we also had basically
you may have had a similar experience and thought, wait a minute, this needs to go into the soup.
Exactly as you described, and we even have a basically in our foundational 4 techniques, basically a meta practice, sort of a stripped down meta practice with not a lot of moving parts, but that's basically the effect. So thank you.
Jerry, thank you so much for your clarification. It's and your honesty in talking about states of consciousness. I've been talking to Brian and saying that all this cloying coyness around, oh, we can't talk about that stuff, and as if you're saying where you're at is going to somehow, I don't know, make me do more mood making in the TM tradition. It's breathtakingly refreshing to have you say honestly, what your experience has been. Scott Eaton and I have been talking for, I don't know, maybe about 2 years now about this. And judging from that, I personally am, as somebody who did go through AGTC at 24 and now I'm 70 and haven't been doing the practices of any kind really on a really regular basis since about grad school. What I found a few years ago was this sort of partial witnessing. Anytime I tuned in, the witnessing and unbound is there, and it stays. If we're having this talk, for example, it's very definitely there. And of course, if I lose my temper at my husband or whatever it is there, I'm sort of still, I call it imperfect CC, which actually seems to be reasonably accurate. And I am now very, very interested in seeing whether I can add some practices that would move me to more solidifying witnessing. But what I wanted to ask about was the relationship between these Sanskrit mantras that Maharishi used and the names of gods, because at 24 at AAGTC, I remember hopping around and, well, I'd read about Krishna and the milkmaids, and it was basically interesting stories and Blue Krishna. Suddenly, it's not, I didn't exactly have an experience of Krishna. What I had an experience of and have continued to this day very strongly is devotion to Krishna, and the sense of that opening of the heart and being almost, and that milkmaidness. And so I wonder now, as you're talking, whether the mantra that I have might well indeed have something to do with Krishna, and why, who I am. That's what happened and continues to happen if I tune into it.
Well, my own experience with now I'm not a Sanskriti or a pundit, and I don't really have a concrete answer to, what is the connection between the Bij mantras and the names of the gods and all of that. But the mantra that I learned TM with when I was 19 years old was a mantra for Sarasvati. The mantra was meaningless to me for decades and decades. And at some point, I became aware of what all of the mantras that I know as a TM teacher relate to in terms of the devata that each is associated with. And I learned at that time, I've been meditating, I've been transcending with the mantra for Sarasvati now for all of these decades. And at one point, I began to realize, oh my goodness, Sarasvati is wide awake and alive in my experience. I don't have, sensory experiences of devas. I do have a sense that's always accessible of the Akasha, and that there are presences in the Akasha that I can't, sort one from another, but I know the devatas are there with me. And I know I can feel as I'm doing this that Sarasvati is here. But I had that recognition, this is a pattern of dynamics in my life that have to do with wisdom and knowledge and insight that just flow to me, not in some, sort of mysterious, otherworldly way, but just if I want to know something, and it's there in the back of my mind, and I'd really like to know this or that, or how does that work, or what is this? The information comes to me. I found out about John Main and Christian meditation. That came to me completely unasked for, but I wanted to know. I just wanted to know. And I was looking for something completely other than that. And I just happened upon this article, and I looked at it and I realized, oh my gosh, wow. And of course, I immediately thought, well, thank you, Saraswati, for that. And it's been just, like a river flowing by. There is a Saraswati river in Prayagraj of that stream. So, that's my experience with a mantra for Saraswati, but it's not something otherworldly. These are just the normal dynamics of how you go about finding things out. And there's a lot of synchronicity and happenstance and all of that. And I realized, Sarasvati's way in the mix of this. Similarly, I got initiated a few months ago by the successor to John Main, who is Father Lawrence Freeman, who is now the present director of the World Community for Christian Meditation. To practice, you don't need to go through a course for it. You can learn online. But to try Christian meditation for myself as a part of this research I'm doing. And so most take up the mantra Maranatha, which is Aramaic. Now, if you look at Aramaic, let me get his name.
You're looking for Neil Douglas Klotz, great
Neil
books.
Douglas Klotz, PhD, the world authority on Aramaic Jesus and what was the worldview and what was the nature of teachings during that time. He was interviewed by Rick Archer, And in that interview, Rick asked him the $64,000 question. And that is, in Sanskrit, we have the idea of name and form, and that a Sanskrit word resonates with the thing that it represents. Is there something like that in Aramaic? And he said, oh, yes, there is.
Yeah.
Well, I began meditating, 2-3 months ago with the Aramaic mantra, Maranatha, which is a little bit clunky. It takes a little longer to settle into effortlessness with that technique, but you do. And it becomes just as effortless and just as easy and spontaneous as we're familiar with TM with these little shorter beach mantras. And I wondered now, Maranatha means Lord come, or Lord has come, or is come. And I have issues with the Christian idea of Lord. You must accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, or you will go directly to hell. Okay. So here I am now. I'm tiptoeing into the fire pit of the Christianity, the fundamentalist Christianity that I grew up with. And I have to somehow make peace with this mantra that has some reference to what modern Christians are calling Lord. And I was trying to find other mantras that would be suitable from Aramaic or Hebrew. And I kept coming back to Maranatha. And I figured out, well, then I'm going to have to somehow or other make my peace with this word Lord as it relates to this mantra, Maranatha. And I kind of let it go, but I thought maybe it'll solve itself because it's a prayer that's asking the Lord to come. And in this case, it was kind of like, well, what are you? What is this? I'm not thinking of it as a personal being like a Jesus or God or something like that. And gradually I encountered discussions and interviews with contemplative Christian leading thinkers and teachers who practice centering prayer or Christian meditation. And they started talking about the contemplative awareness. And what are they talking about? They're talking about Brahman. Okay? It's just Brahman. They're talking about the unitive experience. They're talking about all things are infinitely interconnected and unified. And I thought, oh, okay, well, let's dissolve all this detritus of culture and childhood emotional trauma, and let that mantra just do whatever it wants to do. And I'm having a wonderful time with it. I'm really enjoying it. It's a lovely experience.
I wanted to say something to CJ. An excellent list of mantras is the book by David Frawley on mantras. It's a fine little index book. I think it's titled Sacred Sounds and Bija Mantras or something like that. But it's a fairly exhaustive listing as an index book of mantric science and mantras pegged to different deities at different facets of divinity. So it's a lovely, fine book.
I was hoping to ask both of you really a little bit about, I guess I'm still kind of highly conditioned to think that one has to be very, very careful when using sounds on a subtler level. And so, we all know how Maharishi basically as teachers, how he assigned, us to delegate mantras as teachers. And I am still sort of, as I say, brainwashed, if you will, to think that one needs to be extraordinarily careful. So how do both of you take it as looking at all these other mantras? And I guess I feel like I need to be it's not so much that I have any problems with the mantra that was assigned to me. I would be Ishtar, I would be incredibly interested in learning some of these other techniques. And Jerry, what you had said about basically that the techniques need to be where you are in terms of your development of non-duality. And I would be very interested at this point to start learning techniques that are appropriate to where my consciousness actually is. And as I've said to Brian, this is exactly the kind of discussion where we're honest about where we're at, not covetous of where somebody else might be, but genuinely interested in figuring out how to move forward.
So Ishtar, what is your comment about the question of danger associated with using mantras?
I think, and I don't know, and not that much, unless one's talking about something like cream, you know. But even then, I don't think somebody doing a harsher Kali mantra is going to gum up the works all that much. I if I'm working with Sanskrit mantras with people, it's maybe a little bit different because either usually I know people very well already, and often I have people's birth chart. But even without that, I started to have an experience some time back where I would be hearing, I would start to spontaneously hear Sanskrit running through people, and there would be a certain tone that I don't know, I had a sense wanted to be thought more and wanted to be tuned into more, almost as if it's like the trunk of their tree, and the trunk of their tree wanted some attention. And so I started tuning into that, and I would tell people that mantra, and then I would just check and see how they were doing here and there, and it seemed to be very positive. So I was kind of coming in as an experimentalist in that sense. And sometimes I would be with a person, and I would see visually, not even sometimes in like normal reality, there'd be people where I would see Krishna standing behind them with his hands lovingly on their shoulders and kind of pointing. I was not coming from the TM standpoint where we thought we need to be stuck with one mantra for life or something like that. For it wasn't part of the thing at all. It would just be like, well, it seems like clean's good medicine right now, and we would try that out. And so often I would hear Sanskrit running in my own system. I would hear this echo of actually like a river. As you mentioned that before, Jerry, as an analogy, would feel these tones in the body.
Let me add a little bit from my perspective and support what Ishtar has said. Number one, I agree that this idea that you have one mantra for life doesn't really work. I've changed mantras here and there. I've picked up mantras that I continue to use and mantras that I may use, less. It's a very spontaneous thing. And it's really interesting for me because it's like watching a movie, okay, what am I, because I tend to practice rather spontaneously. I do a lot of meditation when I'm walking, eyes open, just as Ishtar was saying. Okay, so here's a comment on this continuum of the upayas, duality and non-duality intermixed, and pure non-duality. So what happens if I'm already witnessing all the time or in unity consciousness, and I close my eyes and think a mantra? Well, maybe the mind is going to become quieter, but the transcendent is already there. So how am I going to get something bigger by closing my eyes and going, quote unquote, inward? Because there's no in and there's no out. There's just everything. And so I often meditate when I'm walking or and sometimes out loud. And what I experience when I do that is bigger than meditating with eyes closed because it involves the senses and it spreads out to the whole universe. So that's an example of a Shambhavapaya or Shaktapaya practice rather than an Anuvapaya practice, which just takes you to the transcendent and takes you out of the world like that. So that's an example of how you might tinker with practices to find one that's more appropriate. You know, for example, to stabilize witnessing, as you were discussing. How about trying an eyes open walking meditation? And how about this walking out loud meditation? Because my experience with out loud is that there's something about the physical sensation of resonance of my voice in my body that, and the sort of motivation involved in singing out that engages the heart, the feelings. So all of that is engaged more if I'm singing than it is if I'm just doing mentally or doing mentally with eyes closed. Now, would that be an appropriate practice for somebody who's never transcended? Probably wouldn't get very far with that.
Yeah.
That person needs an Anuvapaya practice
Yeah.
like that. So there's a whole universe for us to explore from all of the different traditions and figure out how to put all of this together.
Yeah. My dearest and oldest friends in my own meditation practice are actually Catholic nuns, but they're in what I would call maybe a slightly rebellious, which means more fun, group called the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. And so they have a lot of latitude in what they do because in the Vatican Council in 1962 they cut a lot of nuns loose, and so that means they get to, go do strange meditation practices. And so I've taught a lot of Catholics in that sense, and I've taught of the Ascension practice. And since it doesn't really step on the toes of at least their part of the Catholic umbrella, it's great. And they love doing it, and taught them mantras too. But I don't know what folks who are close to Pope Benedict, his part of the Catholic Church. That's a very different part of the umbrella. So it's I can't really answer broadly, but at least for all the renegade nuns, it goes swimmingly. And a lot of my nun friends already have various different heart opening techniques that they're doing. Most of them either have a service, some kind of service that's in addition to how they make their money, or their money making and vocation are in the same boat. So they kind of have a nice full spectrum spiritual practice between meditation, contemplative practices, and then I would call them Catholic meta practice.
A couple of questions. The first one is about ethics. What we've seen, and we've had a lot of discussion in this group about the indication that there are people who can have great experiences, or they can have been, at least have been meditating for many decades, and yet their ethics are not up to our standards. Let's put it like that. So we've often wondered about whether there are supplementary techniques or lessons that would, as a person develops an inner experience, that would help them to become more ethical, which means to become a more well-rounded person as a whole, because the two things seem completely incompatible, to have as levels of enlightenment and yet lacking in ethics. And here we get into a whole discussion of Ravana and so on and so forth. So any thoughts on that, Ishtar?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't, obviously it's such a big subject. I don't have want everything thought out, but I think compassion or metta practices being in the bunch, in the one's spiritual grouping of spiritual practices has a good effect on that. I don't think that's the end all be all, but I think it goes a long way when people when their heart is actually opening in that way and seeing deeply into the humanity of another as their own self. I think that has a tendency to inform ethical behavior to a certain extent. But again, I think humans are naughtier and more complicated than that, so I don't think it's a cure-all.
But could you give us an example of the compassion techniques that you're talking about?
Oh, well, some of them can be very, very basic. Even to the point of this is an early one, but long before Ascension, I would simply from my own heart put my awareness on somebody who had been causing me problems in life, for instance, or someone I had an antagonistic relationship with. And I would basically invite myself to see into how they were also a baby at one point, or see them as a baby, as a child, and open up in that way. And it was very difficult from that point to just to dehumanize them. Didn't mean I couldn't have boundaries up with those people, of course, but it went a long way into thawing them. So that's a very simple one, like that. Something we did at our monastery, which is more maybe selective, but when we'd be getting on each other's case as sort of semi-cloistered and cloistered monkish types tend to. I remember our teacher would one of our teachers would take a picture of like mystic Jesus or something and put it in front of their faces, like, this is who you're actually talking to, et cetera, et cetera. And as humorous as that was certainly actually touching into, I think, a more profound sort of thing is to even, just as a supplemental practice, see divinity in other people, if the baby ain't working, or maybe do them both. So that's one. And then in my own time, I just loved giving out love. Wish I would have a practice even when I wasn't feeling it, of course, letting my attention go out from the heart to all beings everywhere, and even saying various prayers to the extent of, may all beings become free from suffering, et cetera, et cetera. And that, as simple as it seemed, I think in pairing with the mantra type practices had a wonderful effect. But I think there are also various therapeutic techniques recently developed the last 150 years that of course for many people are going to be profound drivers in having their behaviors line up more closely with their ideals. And I think a lot of people, like, I think of Chogyam Trungpa, he screams trauma to me, where when I feel into him, I'm seeing profound abilities and profound trauma. And so there'll be certain cases where people, I don't know, need whatever the hell the Gabor Mate treatment is, to kind of decrease, more substantial blockages. And so that's another thing. I did not have the type of Tibetan diaspora type trauma in my system that I think Trungpa had, and other folks have had profound sexual traumas that I did not have to go through as a child. And so those things, I think, are often the drivers of those bad behaviors. Those people were going to take a little bit heavier medicine than a bunch of meta practices.
Example of a beautiful compassion technique, which is not presented as a compassion technique, is in about a 15-minute video by our friend Kekuni Minton, who, as I said, was a member of Purusha and a TM teacher for years and years, and is now a quite renowned PhD psychotherapist. He has a set of guided mindfulness meditations, and the first one that I found, I can't remember what he calls it, but he describes how to become highly aware of your own feelings and sensations. What am I experiencing right now? And then he takes you through and says, now think of someone who is an adversary to you, who experiences the world in a completely different way than you experience it, and has a completely different idea of who you are than you have. Now, maintain your awareness of your own experience, and now feel what it would be like in that person's experience, completely different from you, but authentic and intact, and with its own integrity. And feel into that until you feel you have a sense of what is that person's experience like, and maintain the two for some amount of time. And he, I don't remember exactly how he goes through it, but I thought, oh, beautiful. And what kind of a practice is that? That clearly is a Shambhavopaya practice. That's a practice of pure non-duality. Maybe there's a little, this goes on a continuum. Maybe there's a little flavor, a little seasoning of duality in there, just so that you can maintain experience. But the only reason for the sense of that person is over there and this person and I'm here is so that you can have the unitive awareness of, oh yeah, we are one, even in our difference like that. So there are practices out there. There must be thousands and thousands of them that could be brought to bear. We just have to learn. We have to find out. We have to learn more about them and figure out how to make them available to ourselves and to others.
My second question, Ishtar, you hinted at advanced techniques that you teach, and I wonder if you could give us some hints about what those are.
They're varied, and in this, say, the Ascension world, the first four techniques are fairly universal in their scope. Further on down the road, I would have to say that they almost have a built-in. I'm sure you're all familiar with being in the TM world with Samyama. I'm sure they kind of have a built-in, they sort of like edge and lead one in that direction without making it explicit. And so, for instance, there's a technique where I'm invoking praise, but I'm also I'm doing it. My attention is going into the sun, or my attention is I'm putting my attention to the top of my head while praising the sun. And so that's one example. There's also like a technique with the moon. Some of them look like they're a little bit inspired by the third chapter of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, but others of them are, if you're familiar with the third chapter, there's talk of Samyama and this, that, and the other thing, et cetera, and you get this from that. And so some of those were instantly profound for me, is because they were basically working different subtle channels in my nervous system. And some of those subtle channels were quite open at the start of practice, and it was like I could go right up the elevator. And others were quite closed up when I started. So those were basically dormant for 15 years, and others were like putting my attention on the base of the spine in concert with some of these practices. That was like a very quick one. I felt myself somehow basically in the root chakra, but like a unitive root chakra of all beings. And I was like, whoa, what the hell is that? It's just like this sense of very like a non-local flavor of being somehow connected to, I guess exactly as I put it, it's very hard for me to put into words, but the effect on the person was just profound peace in that sort of way. So that's what some of the advanced ones are like. Then it gets into some that are almost more contemplative. And so I'm thinking Om, and then I'm putting my attention on just a like a thought, those aren't very effective for people. I would never teach those as a beginning meditation practice, even in the Ascension. But after having sort of samadhi stabilize, when I would use those techniques, good Lord, I would be having sort of God reveal itself to me through whatever I was putting my attention on. Like, for instance, there was this one where it was straight out of Patanjali, and I would think, Om the tortoise. And there's a reference in the Yoga Sutras that a certain point way down is very like it's very similar to looking at a tortoise from above. And I was indeed supposed to put my attention way down, and basically would find myself in this very interesting flavor of transcendence, and do the same with the pole star. Kind of those are later on down the road, but that was and everything in between. So that was kind of interesting. So those are the more esoteric ones that are like kind of usually reserved for people who are in the teacher training program, who've had a little bit of shall we say, traction and sort of stability in witnessing consciousness.
One principle is that the word Brahman is based on the Sanskrit word bri, and that means to grow. Now, a characteristic of Brahman is that it is paradoxical in the sense that it is always and immediately complete and infinite and universal and all-containing. And simultaneously, it never stops growing. It gets bigger and bigger, and it never stops getting bigger and bigger. So all of these experiences and journeying and new dimensions opening up and, new experience, that's all just part of it. It's not like you get enlightened and then everything just becomes completely flat and stagnant and nothing ever changes. It becomes more and more and more dynamic. And there are the statements, Brahman devours everything, or Brahman is the eater of everything. It just keeps going on and chewing off more and more and more possibilities and incorporating them into itself, bigger and bigger and bigger. And also Brahman is the charioteer.